Little did the arrogant bankers know that the humble farmer they mocked and kicked to the curb would return not as a broken man, but as a beacon of hope, backed by someone who witnessed their cruelty and held the power to change not just his fate, but the destiny of an entire region. Thomas Anderson's humiliation at Sterling National Bank was about to become the catalyst for a revolution that would shake their small farming community to its core. The morning sun painted the vast cornfields of Cedar Valley with strokes of gold, its rays catching the early dew that clung to the withering stalks. Thomas Anderson stood at the edge of his field, his calloused hands wrapped around a rusty fence post that had stood there since his grandfather's time. The sound of violent coughing echoed from the old farmhouse behind him, each painful echo making his weathered face crease with worry. Inside the century-old house, Thomas's tin box lay open on the kitchen table, its meager contents spread out before him. 20 years of careful saving, and still it wasn't enough. Sarah, his wife of 25 years, emerged from their son's bedroom, her once bright blue eyes now shadowed with exhaustion and fear. "The fever's getting worse, Tom," she whispered, her voice catching. "Michael couldn't keep anything down this morning. Again." She slumped into a wooden chair that had been part of their wedding gifts, the same chair where she used to nurse Michael when he was a baby. "The local doctor says there's nothing more he can do. We need those specialists in the city." Thomas closed his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the summer heat that had devastated half his crops. Their son, Michael, barely 18 and full of dreams about modernizing the family farm, now spent his days in a feverish haze, his once strong body growing weaker by the day. The mysterious illness had started 3 months ago, right when the drought had begun, to strangle their corn crops. Through the kitchen window, Thomas watched his remaining farm workers arrive in their dusty pickup trucks. Old Joe, who'd worked these fields alongside Thomas's father, gave a solemn wave as he headed toward the irrigation system they'd been trying to salvage. Behind him, the Martinez brothers began their daily battle against the unforgiving soil, their movements mechanical but determined. Thomas could barely afford to pay them anymore, but they stayed out of loyalty. And because they knew that if the Anderson farm failed, it would only be a matter of time before other family farms in Cedar Valley followed. "I've made up my mind," Thomas said, turning to Sarah. His voice was steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "I'm going to Sterling National Bank today." Sarah's face paled. "Sterling? Tom? They're the ones who foreclosed on the Hendersons last spring, and the Wilsons before that." "I know." Thomas ran his fingers through his graying hair. "But they're also the only bank within 100 miles with enough money to help us. Michael needs those specialists, Sarah. The consultation alone costs more than we make in 3 months." Sarah stood and walked to the old cabinet where they kept important documents. From its depths, she pulled out a worn leather folder, the deed to their land. 4 generations of Andersons had worked this soil, had built something from nothing. Thomas's great-grandfather had planted the first seeds during the Great Depression, and somehow the family had held onto it through every hardship since. "The land's all we have left to offer as collateral," Thomas said softly, taking the folder from her trembling hands. "But our boy's worth more than any piece of earth." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Let me iron your blue shirt at least, the one from Michael's graduation." As Sarah busied herself with the ironing, Thomas climbed the creaking stairs to their son's room. Michael lay in his childhood bed, the quilt his grandmother had made, pulled up to his chin despite the summer heat. His cheeks, once ruddy from working in the fields alongside his father, were pale and hollow. "Dad?" Michael's eyes fluttered open, bright with fever. "Are the corn prices up?" Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, taking his son's burning hand. "Don't you worry about the corn, son. You just focus on getting better. I'm going to the city today to make arrangements for you to see those specialists." "Don't." Michael coughed, his whole body shaking. Don't lose the farm because of me, Dad. I know what Sterling Bank is like. Hey now, Thomas squeezed his son's hand gently. This land means nothing if we don't have you healthy and strong to help run it. Your great-grandfather used to say that the soil knows the difference between a farmer who works for profit and one who works for love. Everything I do for love, of this land and of you. As Thomas prepared for the journey to the city, he had no way of knowing that this day would become legendary in Cedar Valley. The story of a desperate father's humiliation would spark a chain of events that would not only save his son, but transform an entire community's future. Sometimes, he would later reflect, the darkest moments come just before dawn, and this dawn was about to break over Cedar Valley in ways no one could have imagined. The 2-hour drive to Sterling City felt like an eternity to Thomas. His old pickup truck, a faithful companion through 15 harvests, groaned with every mile on the dusty highway. The air conditioning had given up years ago, and the hot summer air whipped through the open windows, carrying with it the scent of sun-baked earth and dying crops. Every few miles he passed another farm, showing signs of the drought's merciless grip. Withered fields, empty silos, and weathered for sale signs that had become all too common in the region. Thomas had dressed in his best clothes. The blue button-down shirt Sarah had ironed, pressed khakis, and the only pair of dress shoes he owned, bought for his son's high school graduation just last year. His weathered hands felt strange against the leather folder containing the farm's deed and the medical documents that detailed Michael's mysterious illness. In the breast pocket of his shirt, he carried a small photograph of Michael standing, proud next to their first successful organic corn harvest. The picture had been taken just 4 months ago, before the illness had taken hold. The Sterling National Bank building rose before him like a fortress of glass and steel, dwarfing the surrounding structures in the city's financial district. Thomas parked his truck in the vast underground garage, painfully aware of how out of place it looked among the gleaming luxury vehicles. As he stepped out, he caught his reflection in a chrome pillar. His shirt was wrinkled from the long drive, and despite Sarah's best efforts with the iron, it couldn't hide the years of hard work etched into every fiber of his being. "Lord, give me strength," he whispered, a habit he'd inherited from his mother. Clutching the leather folder like a shield, Thomas made his way to the elevator. A group of young executives in tailored suits stepped away slightly as he entered, their designer briefcases held closer. Thomas pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the numbers lighting up as they ascended. The bank's lobby was a cathedral to wealth, with marble floors that clicked beneath his dress shoes and crystal chandeliers that threw dancing lights across the walls. The air conditioning was set so cold that Thomas could see his breath, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat outside where his crops were withering. At the reception desk, a young woman in a crisp blazer looked up from her computer screen, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in his appearance. "Welcome to Sterling National Bank. How may I assist you today?" Her voice was polite but distant, like winter frost on a window pane. "Good morning, ma'am." Thomas removed his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. "My name is Thomas Anderson. I'm here to speak with someone about a loan. He paused, swallowing hard. "It's rather urgent." The receptionist's manicured fingers danced across her keyboard. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Anderson?" "No. Ma'am, I drove in from Cedar Valley this morning. It's about my son, you see. He's very ill, and I'm afraid all our loan officers are fully booked today," she interrupted, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone explaining something obvious. "You'll need to make an appointment. Our next available slot is in 3 weeks. Thomas felt his heart sink, but he stood his ground. "Please, my son doesn't have 3 weeks. I have all the paperwork here, including the deed to our farm, as collateral. It's been in my family for 4 generations, and it's worth—" "Sir," She cut him off again, her voice dropping to avoid attracting attention. "This is Sterling National Bank. We deal primarily with corporate accounts and high-net-worth individuals. Perhaps one of the local credit unions in your area would be more suitable?" Before Thomas could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit was greeting someone, his booming voice echoing across the marble floor. "Senator Williams, what a pleasure to see you again. How was your trip to the Hamptons?" The receptionist's demeanor changed instantly as she stood to get a better view of the important visitors. Thomas seized the moment, his desperation overwhelming his usual reserved nature. "Please," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My son Michael, he's only 18. The specialists say, without treatment—" He pulled out the photograph from his pocket, placing it gently on her desk. This was him just 4 months ago. Something in his voice, or perhaps the photograph of the smiling young man, seemed to reach past her professional facade. She glanced around quickly, then leaned forward, speaking in a hushed tone. "5th floor, loan department. Ask for Mr. Richardson. I can't promise anything, but he sometimes takes walk-ins if he's not in meetings." She straightened up, her voice returning to its professional tone. "The elevators are to your right, sir." Thomas carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket, nodding gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am. God bless you." As he walked toward the elevators, Thomas could feel the stares of other bank customers, the men in expensive suits, the women in designer dresses. He heard whispers, saw the sideways glances, but he kept his head high, thinking of Michael's fever-racked body back home, of Sarah's worried eyes, of the farm workers who depended on him. The elevator ride to the 5th floor felt like ascending to judgment. When the doors opened, Thomas stepped into a world of mahogany doors and plush carpeting. A sign on the wall read, "Loan Department, Sterling National Bank, building tomorrow's success." Thomas almost laughed at the irony. He wasn't here for tomorrow's success. He was here to prevent tomorrow's tragedy. Little did he know that behind one of those mahogany doors waited an encounter that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone in Cedar Valley. Sometimes, Thomas would later reflect, the most important moments of our lives come dressed as our greatest humiliations. The loan department's waiting area was empty except for a young secretary who barely looked up from her computer as Thomas approached. The clicking of her manicured nails against the keyboard echoed in the silence, punctuated only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant ring of phones. "I'm here to see Mr. Richardson," Thomas said, clutching the leather folder containing his farm's deed. "About a loan." The secretary glanced up, her eyes performing the same dismissive scan Thomas had endured downstairs. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." But Mr. Richardson is very busy," she interrupted, returning to her screen. "He only sees clients by appointment, and they must meet certain financial prerequisites." Just then a door opened, and a tall man in an immaculate charcoal suit emerged. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his gold cufflinks catching the light as he checked his Rolex watch. This was clearly Mr. Richardson. Everything about him exuded authority and success. "Sir," Thomas stepped forward, seizing the moment. "Mr. Richardson, my name is Thomas Anderson. I've come from Cedar Valley about an urgent loan." Richardson's cold grey eyes fixed on Thomas, taking in his wrinkled shirt and worn shoes. "Cedar Valley. That's farming country, isn't it?" His tone suggested he was discussing a foreign country, rather than a region just 2 hours away. "Yes, sir. Our family farm—" "Margaret," Richardson cut him off, addressing his secretary. "Why is this gentleman here without an appointment?" Before Margaret could respond, Thomas pressed on, his desperation overwhelming his natural reserve. "Sir, please, it's about my son. He's critically ill, and we need—" "Ah," Richardson's lip curled slightly. Another sob story. Let me guess, droughts killed your crops, medical bills piling up, and now you want the bank to bail you out? He turned to Margaret. This is exactly why I have a screening process. Thomas felt his face burn with humiliation, but Michael's face in his mind gave him courage. He opened the leather folder with trembling hands. Sir, I have all the documentation here. The farm's been in my family for 4 generations. It's worth... Worth? Richardson laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the mahogany walls. Do you have any idea how many failing farms we've had to foreclose on this year alone? The land's practically worthless in this drought. But the soil is rich, sir. Once the drought breaks... Oh, spare me the farmer's almanac, Richardson sneered. This isn't some country loan shack where you can walk in with your hat in your hands and a story about sick relatives. This is Sterling National Bank. We deal in real assets, not dirt and dreams. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a mixture of despair and anger he'd never experienced before. My son is dying, he said, his voice low but intense. All I'm asking for is a chance to save him. The farm is all I have, but it's good land if you just look at... Richardson's face hardened. Security, he barked into his phone. Within moments, 2 burly guards appeared. Escort this person out. And Margaret, make a note. No more walk-ins. Period. Please, Thomas tried one last time, reaching for the photograph in his pocket. Just look at his picture. He's only 18. Get him out of here, Richardson ordered. And make sure the lobby knows not to let him back in. The guards grabbed Thomas's arms roughly. In the struggle, the contents of his folder spilled across the floor, the deed, medical reports, and the photograph of Michael scattering like autumn leaves. As Thomas tried to gather them, one of the guards kicked the papers aside, sending them skidding across the polished floor. No, please, those are my only copies. Thomas dropped to his knees, desperately trying to collect the scattered documents. Leave them, the first guard growled, yanking him up by his arm. Mr. Richardson doesn't want to see them anyway. As they dragged him toward the elevator, Thomas caught a glimpse of his son's photograph being swept up by a cleaning lady. His heart clenched. That picture was from better days, when Michael's biggest worry was whether their organic farming experiment would succeed. The journey down to the lobby was a blur of shame and despair. The same executives who had avoided him in the elevator earlier now watched with a mixture of disdain and uncomfortable fascination as the guards marched him through the marble lobby. The receptionist who had helped him earlier quickly looked away, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. At the bank's entrance, the guards gave him a final push. Thomas stumbled, nearly falling on the sun-baked sidewalk. His shirt, so carefully ironed by Sarah that morning, was now wrinkled and torn at the sleeve. The leather folder, a wedding gift from Sarah's father, was scuffed and empty. Don't come back, one guard warned. Mr. Richardson doesn't give second chances. Thomas stood there, feeling the heat of the summer sun and the stares of passers-by. His hands were shaking, not from fear now, but from a deep burning shame. How would he face Sarah? What would he tell Michael, the farm workers who depended on him? The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but Thomas Anderson wasn't done. Not yet. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone else had witnessed everything, someone who had been disgusted by Richardson's cruelty and impressed by Thomas's dignity in the face of humiliation, someone who had the power to change everything. As Thomas walked slowly back to his truck, trying to gather the shreds of his pride, destiny was already in motion. The darkness of this moment would soon give way to a dawn none of them could have imagined, least of all the arrogant Mr. Richardson, who even now was straightening his expensive tie and congratulating himself on maintaining his bank's prestigious standards. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas sat in his old pickup truck parked in the far corner of Sterling National Bank's lot. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, but he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. How could he drive home to Sarah, to Michael, with nothing but his shame and torn documents? The air conditioning was still broken, and sweat mingled with the tears he couldn't hold back anymore. The truck's cab had become an oven in the summer heat, but Thomas welcomed the discomfort. It was better than the cold efficiency of Richardson's rejection, better than the icy stares of the bank's patrons. A gentle tap on his window startled him from his thoughts. Through the dusty glass, he saw an elderly man in a well-tailored suit, but something about his posture and expression was different from the bank's usual clientele. There was warmth in his eyes, concern in the slight furrow of his brow. Thomas quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve and rolled down the window. "Can I help you, sir?" "Actually," the man said with a gentle smile, "I believe I might be able to help you, Mr. Anderson." His voice carried an accent that Thomas couldn't quite place, perhaps European. "I'm Alexander Kovac. Would you join me for a cup of coffee? There's a quiet diner just around the corner." Thomas hesitated. After the humiliation he'd just endured, the last thing he wanted was more interaction with city folk. But something about Mr. Kovac's demeanor, the genuine concern in his eyes, the lack of condescension in his voice, made him reconsider. I should be getting back home," Thomas said weakly. "My son—" "Yes, your son Michael." Mr. Kovac nodded. "The talented young man who helped you transition part of your farm to organic production, the one who's now fighting for his life, while that pompous fool Richardson couldn't be bothered to even look at his picture." Thomas's head snapped up. "How do you—" "I saw everything, Mr. Anderson, everything." Mr. Kovac's face darkened momentarily. "And I must say, I haven't been this angry in years. Please, join me for coffee. I think we might be able to help each other." 20 minutes later, they sat in a worn leather booth at May's Diner, a small establishment that seemed out of place among Sterling City's gleaming towers. The waitress, an older woman named Betty, seemed to know Mr. Kovac well, bringing him his usual black coffee without being asked. "I'll have the same," Thomas said when she turned to him. His hands were still shaking slightly as he held the warm mug, the aroma of fresh coffee reminding him painfully of home, of Sarah's morning routine. "First," Mr. Kovac said, reaching into his briefcase, "I believe these belong to you." He carefully laid out Thomas's scattered documents on the table, including the photograph of Michael. Everything had been meticulously gathered and organized. Thomas stared at the papers, then at Mr. Kovac, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to whisper. "That picture, it means everything to me." "Tell me about him," Mr. Kovac said, settling back in his seat. "Tell me about Michael, about your farm, about everything Richardson was too arrogant to hear." And so Thomas did. He told Mr. Kovac about Michael's illness, about the drought, about the farm's history. He explained how Michael, despite being so young, had researched organic farming methods and convinced him to convert part of their land. How the experiment had been successful until the drought hit. How the local doctor had been baffled by Michael's symptoms, and how the specialists in the city represented their only hope. Mr. Kovac listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed a surprising knowledge of agriculture and finance. As Thomas spoke about the farm workers who had stayed loyal despite reduced wages, about the community that depended on the success of local farms, Mr. Kovac's eyes grew increasingly thoughtful. "Mr. Anderson," he finally said, placing his empty coffee cup aside, "what would you say if I told you I'm not just a random observer, that I'm actually the majority shareholder of Sterling Agricultural Bank, Sterling National's biggest competitor?" Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. Sterling Agricultural was known throughout the region as a bank that actually understood farmers' needs, but they had no branches near Cedar Valley. What I witnessed today, Mr. Kovac continued, was not just one man's cruelty, but a symbol of everything wrong with modern banking. Richardson and his ilk have forgotten that banking should serve the community, not prey upon it. He leaned forward, his voice intense. I've been looking for an opportunity to expand Sterling Agricultural's presence in this region. What I need is someone who understands the local farming community, someone with integrity and vision. Thomas shook his head, bewildered. Sir, I'm just a farmer. I don't know anything about banking. Mr. Kovac smiled. You know more than you think. You understand the land, the people who work it, their struggles and dreams. That's worth more than all of Richardson's fancy degrees. He pulled out a business card and a checkbook. Here's what I propose. First, I'm going to write you a personal check to cover Michael's medical expenses. Consider it an advance. Then, I want you to become Sterling Agricultural's representative in Cedar Valley. Thomas stared at him, speechless. Mr. Kovac continued, his eyes twinkling. Sometimes, Mr. Anderson, the greatest opportunities come disguised as our worst moments. Richardson thought he was showing you the door. Instead, he was opening a new, well, not just for you, but for every farmer in Cedar Valley who's been waiting for a bank that understands their needs. As the afternoon sun slanted through May's diner's windows, Thomas Anderson felt something he hadn't experienced since. Entering Sterling National Bank that morning, hope, not just for Michael's recovery, but for something bigger than himself. Little did Richardson know that his act of cruelty would lead to a revolution in rural banking, one that would start in Cedar Valley and spread across the entire region. The drive back to Cedar Valley felt entirely different from the journey into Sterling City that morning. Thomas's truck was still old, the air conditioning still broken, but the setting sun painted the sky in hues of hope rather than desperation. In his breast pocket, where Michael's photograph had been, now sat a check that would cover not just the specialist's consultations, but the entire course of treatment. Next to it was Mr. Kovac's business card, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light with each turn of the road. Each turn. Thomas rehearsed the conversation he'd had with Mr. Kovac over and over in his mind, still hardly daring to believe it was real. The elderly banker's words echoed in his thoughts. Banking should serve the community, not prey upon it. He remembered how Mr. Kovac had spent another hour after writing the check, outlining his vision for Sterling Agricultural's expansion into Cedar Valley. We'll start small, Mr. Kovac had said, sketching plans on a diner napkin. Convert your old barn into a temporary office. You'll be our local representative, someone farmers can talk to who understands their language, who's walked in their boots. No marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, just honest banking for honest people. As Thomas turned onto the familiar dirt road leading to his farm, he saw Sarah standing on the porch, her figure silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. She must have been watching for him all afternoon. His heart clenched, remembering how he'd left that morning, full of desperate hope and determination. Tom? Sarah's voice quavered as he stepped out of the truck. She'd been crying. He could tell from the redness around her eyes. How did it... What happened to your shirt? Thomas walked up to the porch slowly, trying to find the right words. How could he explain this day? The humiliation at Sterling National, the miracle meeting with Mr. Kovac, the sudden turn of fate that seemed almost too good to be true. Michael's fever spiked again, Sarah said before he could speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. Dr. Jenkins came by, said we need to get him to those specialists right away, but I told him we had to wait to hear about the loan first, and Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she began to sob. It's okay, Sarah, he whispered into her hair. Everything's going to be okay now. But the bank, your shirt is torn. I knew those people at Sterling National wouldn't. Sterling National isn't the only bank in the world, Thomas said, pulling back to look into her eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Mr. Kovac's check. And sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as our worst moments. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the check, her eyes widening as she read the amount. Tom, this can't be real. How? Over the next hour, as they sat at their kitchen table with cups of Sarah's coffee between them, Thomas told her everything. About Richardson's cruelty, about the humiliation, about Mr. Kovac and his vision for changing banking in Cedar Valley. Sarah listened, her expression shifting from horror to disbelief to cautious hope. But can we trust him? She finally asked. After everything that happened today, I asked myself the same thing, Thomas admitted. But Sarah, you should have seen him. The way he talked about farming, about community, about banking with a conscience, it was like listening to my father talk about the responsibility we have to the land and to each other. A weak voice called from upstairs. Dad? Is that you? Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances before hurrying up to Michael's room. Their son was propped up against his pillows, his face pale, but his eyes alert for the first time in days. Hey, champion, Thomas said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. How are you feeling? I heard voices, Michael said, his words slightly slurred from fever. Did you get the loan? Thomas took his son's hot hand between his own. Something better happened, son. We're getting you to those specialists first thing tomorrow morning. Michael's eyes widened slightly. But how? The farm is fine, Thomas assured him. In fact, it's going to be better than fine. While you're getting better, we're going to be part of something big, something that's going to help not just us, but every farmer in Cedar Valley. As Thomas explained about Sterling Agricultural and Mr. Kovac's plans, he watched hope flicker in his son's fever-bright eyes. Even sick as he was, Michael's mind was sharp, asking questions about the banking model, about how they could help other farmers avoid the humiliation Thomas had faced at Sterling National. Dad, Michael said, his voice stronger than it had been. In days, remember what you always say about the soil? How it knows the difference between someone who works for profit and someone who works for love. Thomas nodded, squeezing his son's hand. Maybe it's the same with banks, Michael continued. Maybe they need people who work for love too. Love of the land, love of the community. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she adjusted Michael's pillows. First, you focus on getting better, young man. Your father can worry about revolutionizing banking in Cedar Valley. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep and Sarah had finally allowed herself to rest, Thomas stood at his bedroom window, looking out over his fields in the moonlight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Getting Michael to the specialists, beginning the work with Sterling Agricultural, facing the community's initial skepticism about this new venture. But for the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt different. It wasn't the crushing burden of desperation anymore, but the energizing weight of purpose. Richardson's cruelty had been meant to break him, to remind him of his place in the world. Instead, it had set him on a path to changing that world, not just for himself, but for every farmer who had ever stood in a bank lobby feeling small and powerless. In the distance, he could see the old barn that would become Sterling Agricultural's first office in Cedar Valley. Tomorrow, it would still be just a barn, but soon it would become something more, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of kindness over cruelty, and a reminder that sometimes humiliation could be the seed from which dignity and change would grow. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed both the Anderson farm and their lives. The morning after Thomas's fateful meeting with Mr. Kovac, Michael was admitted to Sterling City's best hospital. The specialists, no longer constrained by financial limitations, immediately began a comprehensive treatment program. The diagnosis that had eluded their local doctor became clear under advanced testing. A rare but treatable autoimmune condition that had been exacerbated by exposure to certain agricultural chemicals. It's actually quite fortunate you've been transitioning to organic farming, Dr. Matthews, the lead specialist, told them during one consultation. Continuing to work with traditional pesticides could have made Michael's condition much worse. She smiled at Michael, who was already showing signs of improvement after just a week of treatment. Your son's innovative thinking may have saved his own life. While Sarah stayed with Michael in the city, Thomas divided his time between hospital visits and beginning his work with Sterling Agricultural. The old barn's transformation became a community project that nobody had expected. Word of what had happened at Sterling National Bank had spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire, and farmers from across the region showed up to help. Old Joe, who'd worked the Anderson fields for decades, organized the renovation crews. "A banking that knows the smell of fresh earth," he'd said, nodding approvingly as they cleaned out the barn. About time somebody thought of that. The Martinez brothers brought their cousins who worked in construction, and together they reinforced the barn's structure and installed proper flooring. Local craftsmen donated their time to build simple but dignified office furniture from reclaimed wood. Women from the church brought curtains and potted plants, transforming the space into something that felt both professional and authentically rural. Mr. Kovac visited twice during those 2 weeks, each time bringing more supplies and resources. But what impressed the community most was how he rolled up his expensive sleeves and worked alongside them, sharing stories of his own farming background in his native country. "My father was a farmer too," he told them during a lunch break, sitting on hay bales with a sandwich prepared by one of the local wives. "He taught me that true wealth grows from the soil of community trust. The bankers these days, they've forgotten that. They think wealth comes from computers and algorithms." The morning Sterling Agricultural's Cedar Valley branch officially opened its doors. A line of farmers stretched from the barn's entrance all the way down the dirt road. Thomas stood behind his simple wooden desk, Mr. Kovac beside him, as the first client entered. It was Frank Wilson, whose family had lost their farm to Sterling National's foreclosure just 6 months ago. He stood awkwardly in his best work clothes, hat in hands, eyes down, the same posture Thomas had adopted in Richardson's office. "Frank," Thomas said warmly, stepping around the desk to shake his hand, "sit down, please. Tell me what you need." I heard you're different from them city bankers," Frank said hesitantly. "That you actually listen to folks like us." "We don't just listen, Mr. Wilson," Mr. Kovac interjected gently. "We understand. Please tell us your story." And so it began. Frank told them about the small plot of land he'd found, about his plans to start over with a smaller but more sustainable operation. As he spoke, Thomas took notes in a leather-bound ledger, a gift from Mr. Kovac, who believed that some things deserved to be recorded by hand, not just in computers. By day's end, Frank Wilson had become Sterling Agricultural's first official client in Cedar Valley. His loan wasn't large by Sterling National standards, but it was enough to give him a second chance. As he left the barn office, there were tears in his eyes. "You know what the difference is?" he said, turning back to Thomas. "At Sterling National, I felt like a beggar. Here, I feel like a farmer again." The days that followed brought more stories, more opportunities to help. Word spread beyond Cedar Valley to neighboring communities. Farmers drove for hours to meet with Thomas, each carrying their own tales of struggle and hope. Sterling Agricultural's simple approach, understanding the agricultural cycles, accepting land as valuable collateral, and offering flexible payment. Terms that aligned with harvest seasons, proved revolutionary in its common sense. Meanwhile, Michael's health improved steadily. The specialists were amazed by his recovery rate. Though Thomas suspected it wasn't just the medicine. Every time he visited, Michael was surrounded by papers and books, researching sustainable farming methods that wouldn't aggravate his condition. "Dad," he said during one visit, his color noticeably better, "I've been thinking about what we could do with the farm once I'm back. What if we could help other farmers transition to organic methods? Maybe Sterling Agricultural could create special loans for farms wanting to make the switch?" Thomas shared this idea with Mr. Kovacs during his next visit. The older man's eyes lit up. "This is exactly what banking should be," he said. "Not just providing money, but fostering innovation and sustainability. Your son understands this instinctively." 1 month after the humiliation at Sterling National Bank, Thomas sat in his barn office after hours, looking through the ledger. Each entry represented a family, a dream, a piece of land that would be worked with love and dignity. The sun setting. Through the barn windows caught the silver lettering on the wall. Sterling Agricultural Bank, Growing Community Trust. Outside, the drought was finally breaking. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain for the parched fields. Thomas smiled, remembering something his father used to say, "The darkest clouds bring the most precious rain." How true that had proved to be. Richardson's cruelty had been the dark cloud, but from it had come a rain of blessings that was transforming not just his family's life, but the entire community. Little did Richardson know that his attempt to humiliate one farmer would lead to a banking revolution that was only just beginning. And this was just the first chapter of a story that would change rural banking forever. 3 months after Sterling Agricultural opened its doors in the renovated barn, the landscape of Cedar Valley had begun to shift in ways nobody could have predicted. The autumn air carried the scent of hope along with the usual harvest smells, and the community buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. Michael, now fully recovered and bursting with energy, had thrown himself into transforming his father's simple banking operation into something revolutionary. The old barn's loft had been converted into a resource center filled with materials about organic farming, sustainable agriculture, and financial planning. Young farmers gathered there in the evenings, sharing knowledge and dreams while their fathers conducted business below. "It's not just a bank anymore, Dad," Michael explained one evening as they looked over the crowded loft. "It's becoming a community center, a place where farmers can help each other grow." Thomas nodded, watching Frank Wilson's son eagerly showing other young farmers his plans for converting their recovered land to organic production. The Wilson family's success story had become legendary in Cedar Valley. Their small organic plot was already producing premium crops that sold for triple the price of conventional produce. But success rarely goes unchallenged, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Sterling National Bank had noticed the steady stream of clients moving their accounts to Sterling Agricultural, and Richardson wasn't about to let his empire crumble without a fight. The first warning came from Mr. Kovacs during one of his regular visits. "Richardson's been making calls," he said gravely, settling into the handcrafted chair behind Thomas's desk. "He's trying to pressure the State Banking Commission to investigate our operation. Claims we're undermining regional banking stability with our irresponsible lending practices." Thomas felt his stomach tighten, remembering the humiliation in Richardson's office. "Can he do that? We haven't done anything wrong." "No, we haven't," Mr. Kovacs smiled. "In fact, we've done everything right. Our default rate is near zero, our community impact metrics are outstanding, and our clients are thriving. But Richardson has powerful friends, and he's not used to losing." As if on cue, a sleek black car pulled up outside the barn. Through the window, Thomas watched Richardson himself step out, his expensive shoes looking comically out of place in the dusty parking area. 2 men in suits followed him, lawyers by the look of their briefcases. "Well," Mr. Kovacs said calmly, "it seems the mountain has come to Mohammed. The barn fell silent as Richardson entered, his face twisted in a barely concealed sneer. Farmers straightened in their chairs, some touching their caps nervously, old habits dying hard. But Thomas noticed something different in their eyes now. Not fear, but quiet dignity. "Mr. Anderson," Richardson's voice dripped with false politeness. "How quaint to see you playing banker. Though I must say, your choice of premises leaves much to be desired." He glanced around the barn with exaggerated distaste. Before Thomas could respond, Frank Wilson stood up from his chair in the waiting area. "This barn's got more honest banking happening in it than your whole marble palace, Mr. Richardson." Richardson's face reddened. "Ah, Mr. Wilson, I see bankruptcy hasn't taught you humility." He turned to his lawyers. "Gentlemen, note that Sterling Agricultural is apparently in the business of lending to known credit risks." "Actually," Michael's voice rang out from the staircase leading to the loft, "Mr. Wilson's organic farm is now one of the most successful operations in the county. Would you like to see the numbers?" Thomas felt a surge of pride as his son descended the stairs, tablet in hand, looking every inch the modern agricultural banker in his clean workshirt and jeans. The contrast between Michael's confident professionalism and Richardson's citified condescension couldn't have been more stark. "And who might you be?" Richardson demanded. "Michael Anderson, sir. The dying boy you couldn't be bothered to help." Michael's voice was steady, without a trace of bitterness. "Would you like to see how your rejection ended up transforming banking in Cedar Valley?" Mr. Kovach stood, his presence suddenly filling the room. "Perhaps, Mr. Richardson, you'd like to step into our conference room. We can discuss your concerns about our operation there." He gestured to a side room that still smelled of fresh-cut wood. The next hour was a symphony of numbers, facts, and figures. Michael presented their success stories: dozens of farms saved, organic transitions funded, young farmers supported. Mr. Kovach calmly dismantled every legal threat Richardson's lawyers presented, but it was Thomas who delivered the final blow. "You see, Mr. Richardson," he said, pulling out the ledger, "every name in this book is more than just a loan. It's a family, a piece of land, a future. You saw dirt and desperation. We saw hope and possibility. That's the difference between your banking and ours." Richardson's face had grown increasingly purple throughout the presentation. Finally, he burst out, "This is absurd. You can't run a bank like some sort of farming cooperative." "Actually," Mr. Kovach interjected smoothly, "that's exactly what banking used to be. Communities pooling resources to help each other grow. Somewhere along the way, banks like yours forgot that. We're just returning to banking's roots, quite literally in this case." As Richardson and his lawyers stormed out of the barn, the gathered farmers broke into spontaneous applause. The sound echoed off the wooden beams, transforming the humble space into a cathedral of victory. That evening, as Thomas locked up the barn office, he noticed something that made him smile. There, in the dust left by Richardson's expensive shoes, were fresh boot prints from the evening's young farmers' meeting, the next generation already walking confidently toward their future. Michael joined him outside, their breath visible in the cool autumn air. "You know, Dad," he said thoughtfully, "Richardson did us a favor that day at Sterling National. He showed us exactly what banking shouldn't be, so we could build something better." Thomas put his arm around his son's shoulders, remembering the desperate father he'd been just a few months ago. "Sometimes," he said, "the best revenge isn't getting even, it's showing people a better way." Above them, the stars were emerging in the darkening sky, and in the distance they could hear the sound of tractors still working in the fields. The sound of Cedar Valley growing, changing, thriving. The revolution that had started with one farmer's humiliation was just beginning to show its true power. 6 months after Richardson's confrontation at the barn, Cedar Valley had become something of a pilgrimage site for struggling farming communities across the state. The old dirt parking lot outside Sterling Agricultural's barn office, now regularly, hosted vehicles with license plates from hundreds of miles away. Each visitor carried the same hope in their hearts, that the miracle they'd heard about could work in their community too. One crisp winter morning, Thomas arrived at the office to find a group of farmers already waiting in their trucks, frost still coating their windshields. They'd driven through the night from River Heights, a farming region 3 states over that was facing mass foreclosures from another banking giant. Mr. Anderson, their spokesperson, a weather-beaten man named Jim Carter, approached Thomas as he unlocked the barn doors. "We've heard about what you've done here, about how you stood up to Sterling National and created something different." Inside, as the office's wood stove slowly warmed the space, Jim and his fellow farmers shared their story. Their tales of banking discrimination and foreclosure threats were painfully familiar, but there was something different in their eyes. Not the desperation Thomas had once felt, but determination. "We don't want charity," Jim said firmly. "We want to learn how to do what you've done here, how to create our own community banking solution." Michael, who had been quietly taking notes on his tablet, spoke up. "Dad, remember what Mr. Kovac said about banking returning to its roots? Maybe that's the next step, helping other communities plant their own seeds." Thomas looked around the room at the faces of these farmers who'd traveled so far, seeing in them reflections of himself from that humiliating day at Sterling National. But now he had something to offer beyond sympathy. He had a proven solution. "First," he said, pulling out his ledger, "let me show you how we structure our loans here. But more importantly, let me show you how we structure our community." The meeting lasted well into the afternoon. Other local farmers dropped by, sharing their experiences and success stories. Frank Wilson brought samples of his organic produce and his profitable market contracts. The Martinez brothers explained how they diversified their operations with sterling agricultural support. As the sun began to set, Mr. Kovac arrived, having driven through a gathering snowstorm for this meeting. His presence added institutional weight to the gathering, but it was his farmer's heart that really connected with the visitors. "What's happening here in Cedar Valley isn't just about banking," Mr. Kovac told them, warming his hands by the stove. "It's about remembering that financial institutions should serve communities, not dominate them. Each region, each community, has its own unique needs and challenges. That's why we need local solutions grown from local soil." The next few weeks saw a flurry of activity as Thomas and Michael worked with Mr. Kovac to create what they called the Community Banking Blueprint, a detailed guide for other farming communities looking to establish their own sterling agricultural branches. The guide went beyond mere banking procedures. It included sections on community engagement, sustainable farming practices, and the importance of blending traditional agricultural wisdom with modern financial tools. But their expanding influence didn't go unnoticed. Richardson and his allies in the traditional banking sector were watching with growing concern. The success of Sterling Agricultural's model threatened everything they'd built: their power, their profits, their very way of doing business. One evening, as Thomas was preparing to leave the office, he received an unexpected call from a journalist at the State Financial Times. "Mr. Anderson," she said, "we're working on a story about the Cedar Valley banking revolution. There are some powerful people claiming your success is built on unsound banking practices. Care to comment?" Thomas thought for a moment, remembering the day Richardson had thrown him out of Sterling National. "Tell them to come to Cedar Valley," he replied. "Tell them to walk our fields, talk to our farmers, see our books. The truth isn't in numbers on a spreadsheet. It's in the lives being changed here every day." The next morning's paper carried the headline, "Cedar Valley's Banking Revolution, Threat or Promise?" The article detailed Sterling Agricultural's unprecedented success rates, its innovative blend of traditional values and modern methods, and its spreading influence across farming communities. But it was the personal stories that captured readers' attention. Stories of families keeping their farms, of young people returning to agriculture, of communities coming together to support each other. Michael had framed the article and hung it in the barn's entrance. "Look at this quote, Dad," he said, pointing to a particular paragraph. "What started as one farmer's humiliation has grown into a movement that could revolutionize rural banking. Richardson tried to shame you, but he ended up inspiring something he couldn't control." Thomas stood in the doorway of the barn, watching as another group of out-of-state visitors pulled into the parking lot. The winter wind carried the promise of snow, but also the warmth of hope. He thought about how far they'd come from that desperate day at Sterling National, how a moment of cruelty had sparked a movement of kindness. "You know what the real revolution is, son," he said to Michael. "It's not just about banking differently. It's about proving that dignity can grow from humiliation, that community can overcome cruelty, and that sometimes the smallest seeds, even seeds of despair, can grow into something that changes everything." As they welcomed the new visitors into the warm barn office, Thomas saw in their eyes the same look he'd once carried into Sterling National, hope mixed with desperation. But now he could offer them something he hadn't had that day, a proven path forward, a community of support, and the knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest dawns. The spring brought more than just new growth to Cedar Valley. It brought the storm Richardson and his allies had been quietly brewing. The morning began like any other at the Sterling Agricultural Barn office, with farmers dropping by for their usual business and the young organic farming study group meeting in the loft. But everything changed when Michael burst through the door, his face pale with concern. "Dad, you need to see this," he said, handing Thomas his tablet. On the screen was an urgent email from Mr. Kovac, marked "Confidential, Immediate Action Required." Thomas read the message, his hands growing cold despite the warm spring air. Sterling National, along with a consortium of traditional banks, had filed a formal complaint with the State Banking Commission. They were alleging that Sterling Agricultural's community-based lending model was systematically undermining the stability of regional agricultural financing and demanding an immediate audit of all their operations. "They're not just coming after us," Michael said, scrolling through the attached documents. "They're trying to shut down all the new community banking initiatives we've helped start. River Heights, Millbrook Valley, Green Plains, they're all being targeted." Before Thomas could respond, Sarah rushed in from their farmhouse next door. "Tom, you need to turn on the news. Richardson's on State Financial Network, and he's talking about Cedar Valley." The small television they kept in the corner for weather reports was quickly surrounded by everyone in the office. Richardson's face filled the screen, his expensive suit and carefully styled hair a stark contrast to the farmers watching him. "What we're seeing in Cedar Valley and these other communities is dangerous," Richardson was saying, his voice dripping with rehearsed concern. "These so-called community banking initiatives are nothing more than sophisticated Ponzi schemes, playing on rural sentiments while putting hard-working farmers at risk. Sterling Agricultural is making loans based on emotional appeals rather than sound financial principles." A murmur of anger rippled through the gathered farmers. Frank Wilson's hand tightened on his cap until his knuckles turned white. "That snake," he muttered, "after what his bank did to us." But Richardson wasn't finished. "We have evidence suggesting that Thomas Anderson, a failed farmer with no banking experience, has been operating without proper oversight. The entire operation appears to be built on the same unstable foundation as his failing farm." Thomas switched off the television, his face calm despite the storm raging inside him. The office had grown so quiet you could hear the spring birds singing outside. Every eye was on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this very public attack. "Michael," he said quietly, "call Mr. Kovac. Tell him we're ready to open our books completely. Every loan, every decision, every success story. Then call every farmer we've helped. Tell them we need them here tomorrow morning." "What are you thinking, Dad?" Thomas smiled, a plan forming in his mind. "If Richardson wants to talk about evidence, let's give him some. Real evidence from real people." The next 24 hours transformed Cedar Valley into a hub of activity that rivaled any harvest season. Farmers began arriving from all over the region, their trucks and tractors filling not just the barn's parking lot, but spilling onto the surrounding fields. They brought their books, their crop reports, their success stories. Mr. Kovac arrived late that night, accompanied by a team of financial experts and, surprisingly, 2 members of the State Banking Commission who had agreed to conduct an immediate independent audit. "Richardson didn't expect us to welcome an investigation," Mr. Kovac said with a twinkle in his eye. "He certainly didn't expect us to have commissioners on site within 24 hours. Sometimes the best defense is radical transparency." They worked through the night, setting up tables in the barn where farmers could present their documentation. Michael organized the young farmers from the study group into teams, helping collect and organize success stories. Sarah and other farm wives set up a food station, keeping coffee flowing and making sure everyone stayed fed. By dawn, the barn had been transformed into a war room of agricultural finance. Every loan, every repayment, every success story was meticulously documented. The commissioners moved from table to table, their initial skepticism giving way to obvious interest as they saw the real impact of Sterling Agricultural's work. "Mr. Anderson," one commissioner said, reviewing Frank Wilson's file, "this is remarkable. Your default rate is significantly lower than traditional agricultural banks, and your community impact metrics are off the charts." "That's because we don't just loan money," Thomas explained. "We invest in people. When you understand the rhythms of farming, when you know your clients as neighbors rather than numbers, you can structure loans that work with nature's cycles rather than against them." The morning news crews arrived to find hundreds of farmers standing proudly in front of the Sterling Agricultural Barn. Each had a story to tell about how the community banking initiative had saved their farm, helped them transition to organic methods, or supported their children's return to farming. Jim Carter from River Heights stepped forward to tell how their community had replicated Cedar Valley's success. The Martinez brothers presented data showing how their worker cooperative had grown. Young farmers from the study group demonstrated their innovative, sustainable farming techniques. But it was Frank Wilson who delivered the most powerful testimony. Standing before the cameras, his organic certification proudly displayed, he told the story of losing everything to Sterling National and finding hope again through Sterling Agricultural. "Mr. Richardson called this a Ponzi scheme," Frank said, his voice strong and clear. "Well, I invite him to come look at my fields. The only scheme here is believing that farmers can't be trusted to help each other succeed." As the sun climbed higher, Thomas stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching as the story of their quiet revolution spread across every major news network. Richardson's attack had backfired spectacularly, turning what was meant to be an exposé of failure into a showcase of success. "You know what your greatest achievement is, Thomas?" Mr. Kovac said, joining him. "It's not just the loans you've made or the farms you've saved. It's that you've helped people remember what banking was always supposed to be, a tool for building community, not destroying it." Looking at the gathered crowd, Thomas remembered that desperate father who had walked into Sterling National Bank months ago, seeking help and finding only humiliation. That humiliation had planted a seed, and from it had grown something powerful enough to change not just one life, but an entire community's future. The commissioners were already drafting their preliminary report, but Thomas knew the real victory wasn't in their findings. It was in the sight of hundreds of farmers standing tall, proud and unafraid, no longer begging for help, but proving they had the power to help themselves. 1 year to the day after Thomas Anderson had been humiliated and thrown out of Sterling, National Bank, Cedar Valley hosted a gathering unlike anything the farming community had ever seen. The fields around the Sterling Agricultural Barn Office were filled with cars, trucks and tractors from across the country. Farmers who had once stood alone against giant banks now stood together, sharing stories of transformation and renewal. State Banking Commission's report had done more than just vindicate Sterling Agricultural. It had become a blueprint for rural banking reform. The Cedar Valley model, as it was now known, was being studied by agricultural communities nationwide. But for Thomas, standing on the makeshift stage they'd built in front of the barn, the true victory wasn't in the official recognition. It was in the faces before him. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I stood in a marble lobby, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. Today, I stand here feeling part of something bigger than I ever dreamed possible." The autumn sun painted the scene in gold, glinting off the new sign they'd mounted on the barn, "Sterling Agricultural Bank, where community grows." Below it hung a framed copy of Richardson's television interview, now a symbol not of attack, but of triumph. Michael, healthy and strong, stood beside his father on the stage. The previous week, he'd successfully defended his thesis at the State University, a comprehensive study of sustainable farming practices and community banking that was already being implemented in farming regions across 3 states. What my father went through that day at Sterling National Bank wasn't just his story, Michael addressed the crowd. It was the story of every farmer who's ever been made to feel small for believing in the land, in community, and in the dignity of hard work. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her husband and son. She remembered the desperate prayers she'd whispered a year ago, when Michael's illness and the farm's future had seemed equally dark. Now, both had blossomed into something beautiful beyond imagining. Mr. Kovac, who had flown in specially for the occasion, took the stage next. Age hadn't dimmed the twinkle in his eye or the farmer's wisdom in his voice. "When I saw Thomas Anderson being thrown out of Sterling National that day," he said, "I saw something Richardson missed completely. I saw a man who understood that true banking isn't about marble floors and crystal chandeliers. It's about growing hope from the soil of community trust." The crowd murmured in agreement. Among them sat Frank Wilson, now the head of the organic farming initiative that Sterling Agricultural had helped establish. Beside him were the Martinez brothers, whose worker cooperative had expanded to support dozens of families. Jim Carter from River Heights was there too, along with representatives from 20 other communities that had started their own community banking programs. But the real story, Thomas continued, isn't about banking at all. It's about remembering who we are and what we can achieve when we stand together. He gestured to the young farmers gathered near the stage, the next generation who had found hope in working the land. It's about turning humiliation into dignity, despair into determination, and rejection into revolution. As if on cue, a convoy of sleek cars approached the barn. The crowd parted, and out stepped Richardson himself, flanked by several bank executives. A hush fell over the gathering. For a moment, Thomas was transported back to that horrible day in the Sterling National lobby. But this time, standing on the stage surrounded by community, he felt only strength. Richardson approached the stage, his expensive suit as immaculate as ever, but something in his bearing had changed. Gone was the arrogant sneer, replaced by what almost looked like uncertainty. "Mr. Anderson," Richardson said, his voice carrying in the silence. The board of Sterling National has sent me to propose a partnership." A ripple of surprise ran through the crowd. Thomas exchanged glances with Mr. Kovac, who nodded slightly. "We've been watching what you've built here," Richardson continued, clearly uncomfortable but pressing on. "Your default rates are the lowest in the region. Your community impact metrics are unprecedented. The board believes we could learn from your approach." Thomas looked out over the crowd, at the farmers standing tall and proud, at his healthy son, at the community that had grown from the seeds of his humiliation. He remembered Richardson's cruel dismissal a year ago, but he also remembered something his father had taught him. The best soil often comes from composted pain. "Mr. Richardson," Thomas replied, his voice firm but not unkind, "Sterling Agricultural would be happy to teach Sterling National about community banking, but not as a partnership, as a reminder of what banking should have been all along. Your marble floors and crystal chandeliers look mighty fine, but they don't grow anything. Real growth happens here, in the soil of trust and community." The crowd erupted in applause. Richardson's face flushed, but he managed a stiff nod before retreating to his car. As he drove away, Thomas couldn't help but smile at the symbolism. The man who had once thrown him out was now the one walking away, humbled by the power of community. The celebration continued into the evening. Under strings of lights hung between the barn and the nearby trees, farmers and their families shared meals, stories, and dreams for the future. Young farmers demonstrated their innovative techniques, while their elders nodded approvingly. Children played in the nearby fields, their laughter a promise of generations to come. Thomas found a quiet moment to stand at the edge of his field, where this journey had begun. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Did you ever imagine," she asked softly, "that getting thrown out of a bank would lead to all this?" Thomas squeezed her hand, watching Michael lead a group of young farmers in a discussion about the future of sustainable agriculture. "Sometimes," he replied, "the worst moments in our lives are just God's way of pushing us towards something better than we could have imagined." Above them, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed his despair a year. Ego now shining down on his triumph. But Thomas knew this wasn't really his triumph at all. It belonged to every farmer who had ever stood in a bank feeling small, to every community that had found the courage to stand together, to every person who had discovered that dignity could grow from the soil of humiliation. The revolution that had started in Cedar Valley was still growing, spreading its roots across the country, proving that sometimes the smallest seeds, even seeds watered by tears of shame, could grow into the mightiest harvests. 5 years after Thomas Anderson's fateful day at Sterling National Bank, Cedar Valley had become unrecognizable. Not because it had changed beyond recognition, but because it had grown into what it was always meant to be. The once struggling farming community had transformed into a thriving hub of sustainable agriculture and community-centered finance. The old barn that had housed Sterling Agricultural's first office still stood, though now it was just one of several community banking centers in the region. But Thomas had insisted on keeping his office there, even after they'd built more modern facilities. "Some places," he would say, "hold more than memories. They hold lessons we need to remember." On this particular morning, Thomas arrived early, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of promise. He was preparing for a special visitor, a young farmer who had traveled from 3 states away, desperate for help. The situation felt familiar, stirring memories that were still potent after all these years. Michael, now the regional director of Sterling Agricultural's Sustainable Farming Initiative, found his father standing by the window, lost in thought, thinking. "About that day at Sterling National?" Michael asked, knowing his father's contemplative look. Thomas nodded. 5 years ago, I walked into a bank feeling like nothing. Today, we're helping others walk out of banks feeling like something. He turned to his son, marveling at how far they'd both come. Michael healthy and strong, the farm thriving under his innovative leadership. The young farmer they were waiting for arrived right on time, his truck dusty from long travel. Thomas recognized the look in his eyes, that mixture of desperation and determination he'd once carried himself. "Mr. Anderson," the young man said, removing his hat, "I'm James Cooper. I've come about my family's farm in Western Plains. The big banks won't even look at us anymore, and I heard about what you did here in Cedar Valley." Thomas gestured to a chair, not the expensive leather kind found in Sterling National, but a handcrafted wooden one made by local artisans. "Tell me your story, James, all of it." As James spoke about his struggling farm, his sick mother, and the bank that had dismissed them, Thomas opened his old leather ledger, the same one he'd started with 5 years ago. But now, instead of just recording loans, it contained the collected wisdom of hundreds of farming families who had found their way back from the brink. "You know, James," Thomas said when the young man finished, 5 years ago, I sat in a bank feeling exactly like you do now. But what seemed like an ending turned out to be a beginning." He shared his own story, not just the humiliation at Sterling National, but the triumph that had grown from it. As they talked, other farmers began arriving for the day's business. The barn office came alive with the sounds of community banking done right, genuine greetings, shared stories, practical advice exchanged freely. This wasn't just a bank anymore, it was a gathering place for hope. Sarah arrived mid-morning, bringing fresh coffee and her famous homemade bread. She had turned the small kitchen area of the barn into a welcoming space where farmers' families could gather, share concerns, and find support. The same kitchen where they had once counted their meager savings now hosted financial literacy workshops for farming families. Mr. Kovac, though semi-retired now, still visited regularly. Today he was conducting a seminar for young farmers in the loft, teaching them how to blend traditional agricultural wisdom with modern financial planning. His voice carried down to the main floor, still strong and passionate about community banking. "The soil knows," he was saying, "whether you're farming for profit or farming for love. The same is true of banking. Money knows whether it's being used to build or to break communities." Frank Wilson arrived with a group of organic farming students. The program he and Michael had started was now sending graduates across the country, spreading the Cedar Valley model of sustainable agriculture and community finance. The barn's walls were lined with photos of successful transformations, each one a testament to what could grow from the seeds of adversity. As the day drew to a close, Thomas sat with James Cooper, finalizing a plan that would not only save his family's farm but transform it into something sustainable. The young farmer's eyes shone with the same hope Thomas had seen in so many others over the years. "Mr. Anderson," James said as they shook hands, "how do you know this will work?" Thomas smiled, remembering his own journey. "Because farming isn't just about the soil, James. It's about the soul. When we remember that, when we put community and dignity first, everything else grows from there." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Thomas stood in the doorway of the barn, looking out over the fields that had started it all. The setting sun painted the sky in colors of transformation, golds, purples, and promises. Sarah joined him, just as she had countless times before. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I think about that day you came home from Sterling National, your shirt torn, your spirit crushed. Look at all that's grown from that moment." Thomas nodded, thinking of all the lives touched, all the farms saved, all the communities transformed. The humiliation he'd felt in Sterling National's marble lobby had composted into something rich and fertile, not just hope for one farmer, but a revolution in how rural communities could thrive. "You know what I've learned, Sarah?" he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "The greatest harvests often come from the fields we thought were ruined. Every farmer knows that sometimes you have to plow under a failed crop to grow something stronger." As darkness settled over Cedar Valley, lights twinkled from farmhouses across the landscape, each one representing a family that had found hope through the revolution that had started with one farmer's humiliation. The story of Thomas Anderson and Sterling Agricultural had become more than just a tale of revenge or success. It had become a testament to the power of dignity over humiliation, of community over cruelty, of hope over despair. And in banks across the country, photographs now hung on walls showing a simple barn in Cedar Valley, a reminder that true banking, like true farming, is always about growing something bigger than yourself. Sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to show us where to plant the seeds of light.